Monday Night Rugby on Off the Ball.
With Vodafone, main sponsor of the Irish Rugby team. We all belong to the team of us.
Yeah, great to have you with us. So in the URC, which kicked off the weekend, Munster had a big win in Belfast on Friday night. Leinster came up short in South Africa, minus lots of frontline players, it must be said, and against several Springboks. Sharks 28, Leinster 23, the final score in Durban. Connacht, meanwhile, they beat the Lions 33-30, just the second win of this campaign by a Northern Hemisphere team in South Africa. And then there was, of course, round 4 of the Women's TikTok Six Nations. Ireland losing 69-0 to England at Welford Road. England away to France is the Grand Slam showdown in round 5. Ireland will have Scotland in Belfast, neither of whom safe from the wooden spoon, depending on results. Very happy to say, Cian Tracey of the Irish Independent here in studio. Great to have you in.
Cheers, Joe.
And Keith Wood, also with us. Hey, Keith.
Good evening. How are you?
Very well. Let's start at Welford Road then. England 69, Ireland 0. The record margin is 79-0. That was set back in 2002. Lindsay Peat, writing in your paper, Cian, she described that second half as a bit like a 10,000 piece jigsaw where you don't quite know where to start. And that was quite apt, I think. Irish players at work or college today. English team, I think, en route to France to begin a week of prep for round 5. All the ills of the women's game in this country laid bare once again.
Yeah, it was a tough afternoon, Joe. I was over there for my first trip to Welford Road, it's such a cool stadium, like kind of mix of the old style and the new style, and you kind of look forward to what's coming there on May 7th when Leinster are going over there. But anyway, it was probably what we were expecting, really. And if we're going to be honest about it, if England had been a little bit sharper, the scoreline could have been far worse, and that's just the reality of it. We do talk so much about the players going back into work, and I saw Aoife McDermott, who started in the second row, put up a tweet earlier on today, and she's a nurse. And I think it's only when you actually see someone putting something like that up that it really hits home that she was kind of in her nurses like gear, and like there she was going back into work. And I don't know, did it come across on TV, but honestly, the physicality of that game was incredible. The hits that were going in. A lot of them have to be said from the Ireland players as well, in particular like players like Adele McMahon, Niamh Jones, like they tackled themselves into the ground, but England's physicality was just on another level. So I just don't know how these girls do it, like how they pick themselves up and go into work now this week and then look towards playing another game this weekend. So I think even from a journalist point of view, it's such a poor spectacle that we're covering a tournament where there's very little jeopardy in it. Ireland were never going to win that game yesterday, and that's just the reality of it. How could they be expected to win? They're without all their players. We can get 9 players if you included the 2 injured players. Had to really dig deep. They're going to be without another couple more because they picked up a couple of injuries, and Sene Nayupu got sent off. So there's problems everywhere you look at it, and it's only until something changes then we're going to be the same. And it was interesting. Where the press box is situated at Welford Road is right next to the coach's box, so I was sitting right next to Greg McWilliams, and David Nusafora was the one who was sitting right beside him. Now he's the man who can change all of this, and he's sitting beside the head coach, literally has a front row seat for what's going on. So if you want to give girls in this country a fair chance of competing, then something has to change.
It does. There were 15,800 at the game, which was a record, and those records are going to continue to tumble. I'm not sure what the capacity is next weekend in France, but they could sell double those tickets, I would think. And Keith, professionalism has arrived in England now in a big way since 2019. 28 full-time contracts handed out, French players with contracts. The Italians have handed out 25 contracts this year. The Welsh as well. The attendances I mentioned and beyond. Women's rugby has left the station, and the IRFU are still deciding whether or not they want to make the trip, and it's ridiculous at this stage.
Well, it's funny, I know we talked about this before, and I likened the women's game to what the men's game was like when I started, actually, in terms of the amateur sense of it, the nature of the arguments that we were having with the IRFU, and so was every other team having it with their union around the world. The difference in this instance for me is that some of the teams in the world it's gone professional and some it hasn't. So what we see at the weekend is something that is inherently unfair and hopefully not dangerous, because you don't want it to be in that case for amateurs playing against professionals. And it was funny, I was equally thinking of a game we played in the World Cup in 2003 against Namibia, and they were an amateur team playing against us. And the view that we took and I took was that we would remind them that we were professional and they were amateur, and we would play at a level of physicality so that they would stop at some stage. And that's pretty much what happened at the weekend. It becomes incredibly hard to sustain the level of, it's almost onslaught against a team that is trained to be able to withstand all of that. And that's the disparity that sits between it. So it's trying to get your head around it. I'm not quite sure where I sit with this, but at that stage we were getting 50,000 turning up to matches, and there was an awful lot of money being made. And I think when they look at it in that fashion, the game is not generating a huge amount of money in Ireland, if any. And it's trying to push that over the edge so that actually happens, so that it's affordable to be able to sustain a professional team. But even as I look at it at the present moment in time, I still think it's very awkward that a team that has to give up 5 of its players to the 7 circuit means that it's very hard to equate balance with balance. And I know Greg McWilliams talked about the fact that none of those were in the scrum or in the line-out. That doesn't matter. You know, it's you don't want your sort of marquee players, of which some of them are, moving over to play 7s at different times. And it just shows you that it's still at the very early start. But for me, it's very uncomfortable. And it's not good for anybody to watch it in that fashion. And it is great to see the numbers that turned up in England, but it's how viable is the game, you know, and what necessitates the change, and what means, is it a huge amount of money that goes in and makes that work? Is it a huge amount of structure that makes it work? I think we're at the start of, you know, from the time of that letter, from the time of women's rugby taking a very stern and strong stance for itself. The results haven't been great, but I don't know whether they're ever going to be great, because those structural changes take a period of time to change. So what exactly is required at the present moment in time, and are there plans in place to get it? Because I think an awful lot of this would have been already set in stores. So the idea that the 7s were going to be gone was going to happen anyway, because these matches are all announced a long time in advance. So what structural changes are needed, and what sort of money is required, and where is that money going to be found? I still think you can look at different ways of making that money driven, you know, and you want to have a huge number of people going into the grounds to support the women's team, and that becomes incredibly important. It also needs to generate a fair amount of money. But I would say, if you were looking at sponsors and potential sponsors, you would say you have an opportunity to put a line in the sand and start bringing women's rugby to the fore in as much as they possibly can. And they go from an area which, this was a really bad loss. But what can you do to change it around? It's going to require companies to do it, not just the IRFU.
Well, just in December, the government handed over 18 million quid to the IRFU, for instance. This is a government-backed organisation at the moment. So of that 18 million, I'd like to know, where was that spent, for instance? I mean, if Wales can hand out a bunch of contracts, and we're talking short-term here, because I agree with you on the long-term project, but if the Welsh can hand out short-term contracts currently, and the Italians do similarly, then don't you have to keep pace with not even best in class, but certainly what the minimum standard is at the moment in the game? We'll come back to that in a moment, just to revisit the game, just to revisit the specifics of the game, because I'm conscious people may not have seen it. It is worth stating it was 10-0 at half-time, Cian. And within that, the Irish set-piece collapsed. You would have to say 6 scrum penalties conceded. After initially doing okay in the scrum, it really deteriorated, and then the line-out was shaky throughout. There were 2 lost, and there were quite a few then disrupted. But there was some good breakdown work and some last-ditch tackling. You always felt it wasn't the most sustainable business plan, and then second half floodgates opened, and Ireland had to play maybe 25 minutes with 14 players on the pitch. England averaged 10 to 12 or 10 to 11 tries per game in this championship at the moment. So Ireland conceded 11. So in that respect, talk of Italian professionalism or Welsh professionalism, Ireland are still pitching up where they are because this England team is awesome as well.
That is the big issue, the big point in all this, Joe. Like, I've been covering women's rugby for a good few years. The standard is seriously improving. Like, some of the rugby that England played yesterday, like, their skills and show, and that wasn't always the case. So and you can see when the product is good, people will buy into it, because honestly, like, I'd say over an hour after kick-off yesterday, there was still thousands of people in Welford Road, and those English players are superstars. There was grown men, grown women, and kids alike, all waiting to get their autographs, all waiting to get selfies and stuff. So you can see that when the product is good, people will buy into it, and that's evidenced by the fact that it was a record crowd. But yeah, you're right, it wasn't sustainable at all, and it's very hard to be critical of the players or the coaching staff, because, like I said, when they go away, like Greg McWilliams and his coaching staff, they've so little time to work on things. So when the players come in, like, there's an emphasis of not overloading them with too much information. So you're trying to make subtle tweaks here and there. They did that around the line out against Italy, and it had just involved going short, but that was never going to work against a team like England.
Well, they tried it once and got bundled out of touch straight away. Because,
you know, you're just not talking the same level at all. So England knew that as well. So that's the reality of the situation. But, like, that's what I mean, you can't fault the players because, like, their work ethic, and there's such a fine line between patronising as well, because, like, this is international rugby. But
see, on the not faulting them, I'd quibble a touch with you. The context, I think, is the headline news, but we do have a situation where the out half Nicole Cronin missed 2 kicks, one against France, one against England, from
gimme range. Call a spade, yeah.
Yeah, like, probably just not good enough. And whether you're amateur or professional, you know, for instance, we're talking a lot of GA this evening, so we'll criticise amateurs there if they don't perform certain basics, and so that was a big one. Now, the context is she's converting from a scrum half, which again is all important. Like, the line out, we're seeing instances where balls just should be caught. You know, the throw was good and they should be caught. Same with handling errors. Probably decision making. That first half where they were under the cosh and they could have, the free kick could have kicked for touch and moved up the pitch. They tried a set move which came to nothing and under more pressure. Some of the missed tackles, you'd have to say, are questionable again, regardless of amateur professionalism.
But is that, though, like, questionable when you have players that their conditioning is on another level, and you can see that when you're up close and personal, like, with these players, like, it's just not comparable. These athletes are far stronger. They're far, like, when we talk about this in the men's game, when we talk about, like, we'll say South Africa, like, just stereotypically, it's not, you can have a go there because both teams are professional, but these girls don't have the conditioning, they don't have the training hours that they do. So
would you say, though, we've seen this tackling trend across more than just the English game?
Well, we have. We certainly saw it against France. We certainly saw it against Wales in the latter stages. But we didn't really see it against Italy because it was more of a level playing field. This is the point I'm trying to make. I mean, you said it there earlier, Joe. When you see a country like Italy giving out 25 contracts, now they're retainer part-time contracts, but it's because they know they're going to the World Cup, and you don't want a free pass to be given here because Ireland aren't going to the World Cup. Let's say Ireland were going to the World Cup, they had qualified. Would the IRFU be doing something what the Italian Union were doing and giving out 25 retainer contracts to the players? Like I said, to give them, like, a fair chance of competing at this level. Like, everyone knows that they're light years behind, and it's very hard to see how they're ever going to compete, like, in the near future with the likes of England and France. That's the reality of it. Yeah. But when you go below that, they don't have a fair chance to compete, and that's the point I think I'm trying to make, that it's very difficult. Of course you can be critical of, you know, missing a kick in front of goal, and I would agree with you, certain missed tackles and that, but by and large it's not a level playing field. So I think we have to acknowledge when criticism is fair, and also when other people above them could be doing more, I think, to give them a fair chance.
Well, people above them could be doing more, agreed, absolutely. I would say, look, some of the missed tackles against Wales, for instance, were of a standard where you could criticise them, and Wales have been professional for 2 to 3 months. So, you know, and also, for instance, the coach, Greg McWilliams, bringing a huge amount of positivity. Lots of players have queried when he knew that the Sevens players were departing why Sene Nwupa was not in the squad over the previous number of weeks to get on board with her teammates, to practice calls, and the defensive system has changed a touch. So suddenly she goes from not involved at all to starting, and equally Emer Considine seemed to maybe be struggling for form, dropped for the Italian game in the knowledge that she'd have to be then put in against England. Maybe the Italian game a chance to rehabilitate confidence. So I'm not saying it makes a damn bit of difference against England, but I think it would be wrong of us to go, well, they're powerless to do any better. I think in certain aspects, if they're being honest, we should be expecting a bit better from amateurs, even amateurs.
I couldn't agree with you more, and I hope I'm not trying to be like, oh, we can't criticise the players at all, because they don't want sympathy, they don't want people to give them a soft touch. And you're right, but I suppose international rugby, it's a results-based business. Greg McWilliams knew that he would have these best players available. I agree with you, it probably could have been managed a little bit better, because even Sene Ihupu's played very little rugby over the last while, and maybe that showed her technique was pretty poor and she couldn't have argued with the red card. So there's just so much wrong, like Lindsay Pete, which you started this conversation with. It's very hard to know where to start, but and I know not everyone buys into women's rugby, and that's absolutely fine, but you said it, Joe, the train has left the station now. There are thousands of people who are into it, and that's the reality of it. So Keith kind of mentioned it there, I don't know what the answer is either. Is it time for the 7s and the 15s to be separate entities? But then you're weakening kind of the 15s team, because you can see how well the likes of Baveen Parsons, Amy Lee Murphy-Crowe, Lucy Mullen, how well that these girls played, particularly against Italy. They were brilliant, these players. So it's very hard to know, and I certainly don't have the answers, but people who are paid a lot of money should be thinking about this, that what's the best way to go forward. Yeah,
apologies Keith, come in on any of this, including Keane's last point there, the 7s, 15s dynamic.
Yeah, well, look, for me, I don't know that we have a huge numbers of people that are coming through, and there is pathways, of course, there is, and but for us, it seems as if Ireland are trying to accelerate in as many ways as they possibly can. I think to be honest, I think it's very difficult. I think when the 7s is something that may bring more women into the sport, that may be something that you want to hang your hat on. But you'd like it to be able to do both, and I don't know that we can have separate teams, if I'm honest. But having different competitions on at the same time means you're always going to be in a very difficult situation. There's the idea, again, I'm just going to go back to commerciality on this, and it isn't about saying exactly how much women need to get or what way it is. I think very few people would be giving up their job at the present moment in time to go for a professional rugby contract, because I don't know that amount of money is there. So what it is to try and make things a bit easier and to try and be able to devote more time and attention to it. But I mean, these girls are devoting a huge amount of time and attention to it. But I do think we're at this moment in time where we've come from a very difficult period and non-qualification, and it's time to build it back up again, and it hasn't gone well for us. And if we were, again, being brutally honest, the one game that we should have won was against Wales, and the other ones are not like with like. And look, I can tell you, and again, the reason I compare it to professional or to rugby, international rugby, men's rugby, back when I started in '92, was we worked a half day on Wednesday and then went and met up to play. And you were back in the office again the day after the match, and that was the nature of it. And it went full bore because the whole of the international game went full bore professional. That's what happened. I don't know what the full conversations have been in relation to the women's game about the game going fully professional. And so for me, it feels uncomfortable watching a fully professional team playing in a Six Nations game against an amateur team. That doesn't seem to work right either.
Well, there's a comment on YouTube from Jessica Hannon. You wouldn't let an amateur boxer fight against a professional. Watching that scrum walk over our front shows yesterday was dangerous. These girls are in the gym every single day. It's shocking. So that's further to your point about safety. How would you?
We've had this even in the men's game. Sure. and the boys' game, and where you're saying, well, are you entirely happy with people lifting in the line out if they're not doing it professionally all the time, lifting somebody up to a height? That's where the game, for me, sometimes shows a little bit of intransigence, that they don't want there to be any changes from the laws between one age group and another, between professional and amateur, between men and women. And it can still be the same game, but there can be nuances that would go to it. I don't know about that, but I do know it becomes far harder to lift people safely in the air unless you're practicing to do it an awful lot. And if you don't get the chance or whatever it is, or somebody else comes out and they haven't played a huge amount of rugby, we know that would rarely happen now, but it did happen in times past. I just think it's at an awkward moment in time.
And to that end, actually, how would you work it? Say, for instance, there's huge pressure, and I think, Cian, you were talking to Greg McWilliams, and he suggested some kind of professionalism or some kind of contracts are in the pipeline. So say overnight, Keith, we have 20 15s players who are contracted, and say it's just about enough to tempt them to leave their careers. And I'm sure a lot of them, as you rightly say, a lot of them will say, well, for the money you're offering me, I'm not sure I'm giving up the next 5, 6, 7 years of my career development. But say you get 15 or 20 to agree. What's the best use of their time day to day? Is it to play in-house matches, do you suspect? Is it to train away full time but then play in the AIL? Maybe that brings in safety issues there, I'm not sure. Is it to subsidise contracts so that they go play in the Premiership full time or elsewhere? How would it work in the short term, whilst agreeing that long term pathways and bringing more players through is ultimately where they're if you have to go over the next decade?
Well, I think you need to make certain that they're playing here because you want to grow the game here, and there are elements I think that are certain. For me, I would see it not as being fully professional, but being more professional in terms of some money, a huge amount of more support that's required, more technical training, more training camps where possible. Maybe the separation of the two teams, or maybe a guarantee that the competitions won't intersect, which might be a more realistic one to do. And it's funny. I remember, again, I'm harkening back just because it's very similar. Jim Staples, who played with me in Ireland and Harlequins, when the game went professional, he's the first year Harlequins played, training was in the evening time, professional, because a lot of guys wanted to work and they were uncertain whether they wanted to do both. And after a year or two, Jim said, I don't want to do this. I love playing rugby, but this isn't my job. This is actually getting in the way of my job. So he went and continued to work. And that's, that becomes a decision. So it was quite interesting for guys that were 21 or 22 years of age back in 95 or 96 to say, yes, I'll definitely take a contract and that will be fantastic and I can make that decision. It's different if you have a spread of players that are already working or have a profession and want to do very well with that, whether it can fit in or not. And that's what makes it so complex. And I think England have been capable, they're a much bigger union and have been capable to put a lot more money into it. And they're also beginning to generate bigger amounts of income for it. So there's a sort of circle there that if you can make it big enough and get enough of people through the gate, you might be able to pay more money, you might be able to get better sponsorship, higher levels of income coming into the women's game so that you can ensure that this can be done at a higher level. I don't know, it's changed incredibly quickly. I mean, we're talking the last 2 or 3 years, whereas I think England did pay and then didn't pay, and now they're back paying again fully. But there was chopping and changing as to what that would happen. We have been left behind, but it's unusual to have an international game and a competition that it isn't entirely equitable in terms of that. So that makes it makes it really awkward time.
Yeah, it sure is. I'll give you final word, Cian, on the big picture. Because, you couldn't fault the effort in the first half was outrageous against, as you said, physically a stronger team, the last-ditch tackling to keep it 10-0. You kind of saw, almost in some respects, the most important aspect, which is a real hunger to do well. And then the various things we've discussed come to play in the second half. Final thoughts on the whole situation?
Yeah, well, I thought it was encouraging that, I was chatting to Greg McWilliams, like I said, after the game, he did say that contracts were in the pipeline now, and he said, he wants it to happen sooner or later, because of course he does. From a head coach's point of view, he wants as much time as possible. So we don't know what in the pipeline means in terms of time frame. It'd be interesting. David Nusafora, the next time he's up, I'm sure it's going to be something that's put to him. And we got to be realistic. I don't think anyone is expecting like massive contracts to be handed out here, because it's worth pointing out that the men's and women's sevens contracts are not paid all that well. So loads of them do work as well. Yeah. They're essentially part-time contracts. So all these girls who've gone off now and they'll play in the Langford sevens, like a lot of them are either in college or still working. It's the same with the men. Like the amount of work and dedication that those sevens players put in, which is an entirely different story, but it's very much linked. Like you saw after the men's team got to the Olympics, a few of them retired because it just wasn't worth it, because they were going, okay, well, I'm missing out here on years of being on the career ladder. So we've already seen it happen. Even I was talking to Billy Dardis, the sevens, men's sevens captain. He's gone into like a full-time job now as well, which up to the Olympics he was giving her all to it. So that's the reality of it. Like, no one is expecting them to be massively paid or anything. It's just trying to give them a fair chance. So sooner rather than later, like Greg McWilliams says, but like Keith has touched on, it's about finding where that money is going to come from.
Yeah, there are commercial realities, as Keith said as well. So it's complicated, and for sure a very tricky point for all concerned. We'll park that for the time being. Ireland play Scotland in Belfast next weekend. URC table is as follows. This with 2 games to play, so top 8 through to the quarters. Leinster top on 61 points. They're a little bit away from everybody, but then it's so tight. So the Stormers now up to second on 52. You then have Munster on 51, Sharks on 51, Ulster on 51. And Connacht, they're down in 10th. So, well, home advantage for the top 4 is where we are. Just to start with Belfast Friday night, Keith, a win for Munster. First win in Belfast since 2016. It's kind of hard to believe that. Just had to double check that. They led throughout. They were 18-3 up at one stage and then withstood the Ulster fight back. Ulster had the likes of Balakoon, Hume, McCluskey, Mike Lowry at 10, John Cooney, Herring and Marty Moore, Ian Henderson there. Munster had Mike Haley, Keith Earls, Farrell de Allende, Shane Daly was there, Joey Carby played, Craig Casey played, Pack maybe not at full strength. Munster starting to find a bit of a winning habit at a good part of the season.
It did. I mean, certain things have fallen Munster's way and they've taken them when they've happened, which has been good as well. Ulster looked absolutely devoid of energy. I think the loss against Toulouse at the death the previous week had put them. I think it had broken their hearts, if I'm honest. And they looked for the most part flat and a little bit dejected. And for periods of the time, they didn't have any press in their defence. And Munster took that, which I have to say, take very good credit from Carberry et al. And Casey, who I thought his delivery was excellent. They exploited that. Once there was space that they could do things, they did things, and that's a really good thing. They didn't, whether that was the script or not the script, they used the space that was afforded them and used it pretty well. I don't know. I think Ulster kind of got it back a little bit in the second half, and definitely had a decent go in the second half. And it could have been more nerve-wracking at the very end for Munster, because I felt Munster took their foot off the pedal at the start of the second half a little and brought Ulster back into the game. So a mixture between Munster not going for the jugular maybe, and with Ulster probably getting a bollocking at half time and coming out and trying to do something about it. It was an interesting game. I thought Lowry, he didn't struggle at out half. He just didn't attack the gain line at all. And I think he's a lovely footballer. I'm a big fan of his, actually. But he seems to have more space at 15 to do some serious damage. But so we didn't get to see some of his silky running skills. He looked like a guy that could fit in at 10 whenever you need him to, but I don't know that you necessarily want him starting there for 10. So he may not like that, but that's fair enough. But I thought it was a cracking win from Munster. You could see it in the performance. I thought Jenkins had some very good interplay, which is great because we haven't seen him play at all. And then when Ahern came on, I thought he was fantastic. And suddenly the idea of having a very tall, lanky guy, it can be used as a seriously good, potent weapon. And he did. He stole a couple of lineouts, played very well at the end. And a very interesting game. Very interesting how some of the players are developing. Really want to see Alex Candellan step off his foot a little and not just run at guys, because he is not as big at this level as he is at under 20 level, and he is phenomenal. And I thought he was phenomenal. But I'd like him find a bit of space, and I'd like to make certain that Munster would put someone on his shoulder, because he's carrying it a long distance, and you don't want to turn over ball and loose ball. But it was a very interesting game, but a team that seems to want to play a little bit more now in Munster, and then a team that was just totally dejected and flat in Ulster.
Yeah. I mean, a fortnight ago, Keane, we would have been here talking about Ulster's win away in Toulouse, and it's been a painful fortnight for them now. What's the Achilles heel for you in Ulster, that at these kind of crunch games, they're very, very close but not quite getting over the line?
I still think they're too light in the pack, and maybe just short one or two players in the depth. I think particularly in the front five, I think like Marty Moore has been probably one of the most improved players in the country, but once you kind of go below that, there's a couple of issues. Like if you're to be honest and you're to look at kind of the front five or even the starting eight who started against Toulouse, I'm not sure that that's a Heineken Cup winning pack, and that's just my honest opinion. Ulster supporters might disagree. But there's a lot of good things going on in Ulster, but like you said, they're still kind of stuck at that hurdle, and that's why you named out the table there, Joe. Like the running is going to be fascinating. I think one of the most interesting aspects is if Ulster can pick themselves up off the canvas, because that's two demoralising defeats. And I actually didn't think the scoreline really reflected. I didn't think Munster should have kind of been in that situation at the end. I thought they were much better. But even Munster having backed up, you know, the emotional high of the previous week as well was pretty impressive. So I still think Ulster, yeah, like I said, they're just a bit short. Like you look at their backline, and it's excellent, really. And just on Keith's point about Mike Lowry, I think you saw when Ian Madigan came on, like Lowry switched back, and it gave him that little bit more freedom that Keith's talking about. But I also,
Lowry fancies himself as a 10, doesn't he?
He was a 10 in school, and I think he won maybe 2 senior cups up in Ulster as a 10, and Ulster supporters want to see him 10. So it's a bit like the Joey Carberry debate that we were having when he was at Leinster. So I think the reason they're looking at it, obviously Billy Burns was injured, and I'm also not convinced that Billy Burns is a Heineken Cup winning 10 either, if I'm being honest. So Will Addison is out injured at the moment, and he's an exceptional fullback if he can get fit. So in an ideal world, if he was to come back and if he was to be fit, like I think Ulster would like to have him there. But you have to have Mike Lowry on the pitch as well. So I think that's why they're looking at him at 10. I think it's worth seeing again. I don't think it was a great game to judge him on. I do agree with Keith. He's definitely going to have more room and find more space in the backfield. But you'd like to see him behind a pack that was maybe more on it than what they were last weekend, because they were so flat. So I think that's why they're looking at him, because they've got Will Addison in mind, who's hopefully going to come back from injury and put a bit of a run together. But yeah, like Ulster need to pick themselves up again and go this week. Edinburgh, I think, isn't it?
Edinburgh and then Sharks.
Yeah, like they're 2 tough games to finish with, and from a position like we were saying where they look like they were in a decent position both in Europe. Like, let's be fair, they got screwed in Europe with the draw that they got getting Toulouse, because they had done so well in the pool stages. Any other year that doesn't happen. It was just such a strange year that it was. But even that game was a game that they shouldn't have lost either. So yeah, they're going to have to find a way, because they've put in so much good work this season, particularly since that Connacht defeat at the Aviva Stadium, that they don't want to let it peter out now.
Just a quick one, Kate. You mentioned Casey's delivery, very good. Where's the Casey-Murray battle ahead of Toulouse?
I would imagine they'll probably start with Murray. I think what seems to have happened is the 2 different styles that they use to very good effect. But I would say you might start with Murray in this instance, because Murray's brilliant at closing out games. His defence is truly phenomenal. But you need Munster to be in a good position. It's one of those awkward ones. I don't know, because it depends exactly on how Munster decide they want to play, and whether that would be what we saw at the weekend is indicative of how Munster will play, with a little bit more use of the ball. If you're going to play to go a really fast attacking game, you're going to start with Casey. I'm just not so certain that Munster are going to start that way. So it's interesting as to what they'll do, but it all comes down again to style and attitude and the idea you want to do. And when you play against Toulouse, you need to match them in the forwards. You also need to take your chances where you can. You need to stop them doing it. Munster's defence has been phenomenal this season. That's the one thing I would say that has been absolutely world class, pretty much consistently. When they've been under a huge amount of pressure, their defence has kept them in games. and it's stopping Toulouse running away with it. So, I mean, again, it's an interesting one. In the Aviva is not as daunting, I think, for Toulouse. But I do think that there is an opportunity for Munster in that game, and they go into it with a high level of confidence. But it's interesting. I don't quite know where they're going to go because, again, I was surprised and happy, I have to say, to see more ambition. I do think there was more space on the field than they're used to getting, but Toulouse might give them a bit more space outside the 10 channel as well.
And will you take in Ed Sheeran, Keith?
I'll bypass Ed Sheeran.
Fair enough.
Okay. Yeah.
For the purpose of time, we have to be brief here. So Cian Tracey has not missed a minute's rugby. You've seen all of these games. Connacht 33, Lions 30 in Johannesburg. So Connacht could be the only team that complete the clean sweep against South African sides. Beat the Bulls and the Stormers start of the season. So 33-30. They've gone down to South Africa really with little or no hope of top 8, but that's a very good result. And then Sharks 28, Leinster 23, Leinster 17-14 up at half time. They had 2 yellows in the second half. They finished the game in the Sharks 22, a TMO decision, denied them a try. This was very much a young Leinster squad under a lot of physical pressure against a Sharks team which had its fair share of Springboks. Leinster will play the Stormers, which is first versus second in Cape Town on Saturday coming. What are we saying about Connacht and Leinster adventures in South Africa?
Massive win for Connacht, particularly like after Andy Friend had kind of come out after the Leinster game, and said, that we need to improve our professionalism, really, which I thought was like pretty scathing. Like, it was really honest, but it was pretty scathing, and if I was in that dressing room I'd be pretty annoyed. Now obviously it's a conversation that they'd had behind the scenes, but to go public with it, a few players had a point to prove, and I thought they played really well. It was interesting and a good decision. I think like Andy Friend didn't take any of the players who are not going to be at Connacht next season, because he said this is almost where next season starts, that they want to go into next season with a bit of a platform. And it was a super result. Jack Carty kicked a late penalty, and he had actually kicked really well all evening. Obviously at altitude he seemed to be enjoying that, but he had missed one previously, so he showed good character to bounce back from that. But they scored a couple of lovely tries, but I still think defensively, like, the Lions cut through them far too easily, and that's why the scoreline was ultimately so close in the end. Like, no more than Munster probably should have been more comfortable against Ulster. Connacht should have been as well. So there's obviously been massive changeover in the coaching staff this year, but I think it's a big pre-season to kind of iron out those wrinkles that they have.
Yeah, and then Leinster?
Yeah, Leinster, like, that was actually a really, really good result. I think that's the kind of result, like, when you look at the personnel that were playing, that's the kind of result I think like that would really stand to them going forward, because so many of the young players, you had like the likes of Brian Deeney, Lee Barron, who came on making their Leinster debut. So these are the type of guys who in a year's time people will be going, oh, where did this guy come from? Well, he was over in South Africa going up against an unbelievably strong Sharks team, who were littered, like you said, with Springboks. So Leinster could have won that game at the end. They struggled around the maul, they struggled at the scrum, but again, probably to be expected when you look at the type of players that they had. So they're obviously looking to bounce back this week. Ronan Kelleher's after leaving South Africa with a shoulder injury, which is a concern obviously with what's coming up in mind with Leicester in mind. And it's interesting actually, as far as I know, that Johnny Sexton and all the first teamers, if we want to call them that, were actually back in today. And I think Stuart Lancaster, Robin McBride and Felipe Contepomi are now back in Dublin. Right. So Leo Cullen has stayed over there, but this is how Leinster can operate, that they essentially have two different squads with two different coaching staffs in two different hemispheres. Wow. And they're building up. So it's unbelievable really when you think of it. So Stuart Lancaster is back with the first teamers, priming them for what's to come on Saturday week.
Very interesting. Keith, I didn't want to press you for specifics, and I didn't get a chance to see those two games, but any overall thoughts on Connacht Leinster?
I thought for Connacht it's an incredible win away, and I love the idea that he only brought the players that were going to be playing in Connacht next year. I think that's the level of forward thinking that you need to have. And I will just, touching on the idea of having separate coaching staffs able to deal on two hemispheres with Leinster just shows you the riches that they have, and also some of the pressures that they have to deal with, managing that number of players who all believe that they should be starting. And once again, I would say I don't think Leo Cullen gets the credit he deserves for being able to manage that and keep that intact.
Yeah, absolutely. Fellas, we are out of time. Our rugby coverage and Off the Ball is with thanks to Vodafone, main sponsor of the Irish Rugby team. We all belong to the team of us. Great chat, Cian. Thanks for coming to the studio.
Cheers, Joe.
And Keith Wood, pleasure as always. Thanks, Keith.
Cheers, Joe. Cheers, Cian.
Cheers, Keith.
Monday Night Rugby on Off the Ball.
With Vodafone, main sponsor of the Irish Rugby team. We all belong to the team of us.